Well, CBS News space consultant Bill Harwood joins me now on Skype. Bill, we just watched the CBS News special report from 1967. I know you were in high school at the time, but you've studied a great deal on this day. What was running through the minds of the folks at NASA?
Oh, it was a tremendous tragedy. You know, they'd never had as Mike Wallace said, never been a fatality in the space program. Everyone knew it was risky, but you know, there's theory and there's reality. And I think the loss of these three astronauts was a major blow. It was certainly shocking to NASA, and I think to the public at large. I mean, think about it. They were on the launch pad. They didn't even have the rocket fueled. They weren't going anywhere, and yet they had a disaster that claimed their lives. And it really sent shockwaves, I think, through NASA and also through the nation. As you can tell by that special report, this was something that, you know, people were riveted to their television sets to find out what had happened, what might have gone wrong, and what might it do to the race to the moon.
And there were several flaws that were realized in the aftermath of the fire. And if that fire hadn't happened, do you think that NASA would ever have made it to the moon?
You know, that's one of those questions you can't answer. Hindsight's 20/20. They did, in the investigation, find numerous problems with the Apollo command module. It had a pure oxygen environment. There were wiring problems, which probably produced a spark that set off the blaze. There were lots of flammable materials in the cockpit, nylon straps, things like that, that would have burned very rapidly. So, you know, in hindsight, you could see it coming maybe, but would it have happened in flight? It's kind of like the Space Shuttle Challenger. If you remember, NASA was struggling with problems with the solid rocket boosters, and it used to be argued, well, if it hadn't happened on Challenger, it would have happened on another flight. Very possibly true, and it's very possibly what you said could have happened to Apollo.
It's interesting, you know, in the 30 months that followed the Apollo 1 accident, NASA ended up flew 5 Apollo missions. How did the attitude at NASA change? I mean, what motivated scientists to push ahead after a tragedy like this?
You know, it's really interesting. The famous flight director, Gene Kranz, down at what is now the Johnson Space Center, and you might remember him from the movie of Apollo 13, always had the white vest on, failure is not an option. He gave a speech about 3 days after the Apollo 1 fire where he talked about toughness and competence. And this is a speech that really galvanized the people down in Houston. It basically said, look, you know, it's our responsibility to make sure these things work properly. Don't come in this door unless you're willing to dedicate your life to trying to make these things perfect, trying to make them, well, I should say, as perfect as possible. And it's a message that really resonated throughout NASA. And I think the loss of those astronauts really inspired the agency to do some of its best work. And of course, it showed in the eventual success that led to the Apollo 11 moon landing.
What a tremendous message. You know, people may forget this actually happened during the height of the Cold War. President Kennedy had said that we were going to go to the moon by the end of the decade. How embarrassing was this for the U.S. at the time?
No, I don't think it was really a case of being embarrassing. I think that when President Kennedy made this announcement back in 1961 that we're going to go to the moon, if you think about it, he made that announcement right after a single suborbital flight. Nobody had ever, John Glenn hadn't even been to orbit yet when he said, by the end of this decade, we're going to put people on the moon. Well, it was 1967. And I think when this fire happened, in the instant, you know, thinking about this and the delays that were going to come, you know, who knows if we were going to be able to meet the president's promise. So I don't know that I think it was an embarrassment. I think there was some concern, could the Russians possibly beat us to the moon? The space race was a big deal back then. This was the height of the Cold War. Vietnam was going full bore. And I think it was a real shock to the American psyche, and I think that NASA's recovery from it was a very proud moment for the U.S.
Yeah, certainly a fascinating and, as you said, a proud moment in U.S. space relations there. CBS News space consultant Bill Harwood, thank you for your insight, Bill.
Sure thing.